And welcome to Inside Albania with me, Alice Taylor. The world has recently been on edge due to the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. This has now come to an end for now, or has it? I'm joined in the studio today, well, online in the studio, by Christopher Hyland. He's a former guest of Inside Albania, but he was also a formal advisor to Bill Clinton, the ex-president of the United States. He's an expert on the Balkan region, as well as geopolitics, and he's here to give an insight into Iran, the interplay between the US and Iran, and of course, Albania's place amongst it all. I am then joined by a very special guest, Paul Pillar. He is a former chief of analysis at the CIA Counter-Terrorist Center and a former executive assistant to the director of the CIA. I'm going to be grilling him on the MEK, an Iranian opposition group who have been seeking refuge in Albania for several years, as well as more on Iran, Albania, the Balkans, and the US. Christopher Hyland, welcome back to Inside Albania. I'm sorry it's not in person this time. Hopefully we'll have another chance in the future. But thank you for getting up early to join me today.
It's my honor to be speaking with you again, Alice.
It's always a pleasure. Right, first question. We had a pretty tough few weeks worldwide. You know, there was with the Iran conflict with Israel and the US, and I think everybody was very worried that we were heading for World War III. Now, things seem to be calmer. Is it over? Is it paused? Is it concluded but not resolved? What do you think? Is this the end?
It is not the end. It is the constant re-beginning of a multi-thousand-year history. I'm reminded of Alexander the Great, who everybody thought was going to directly engage the Persian army, but instead first invaded Egypt and then went on to other interesting situations before finally defeating Persia. The story is ongoing, persistent, unfortunately, historically, and in this micro context, it will continue as well.
And I mean, is this a situation that you see continuing just at that sort of Middle Eastern level, or is it something you see spilling over into Europe and beyond?
Well, everything that is happening in the Middle East right now impacts Europe. For instance, we are engaged, the United States, Israel, and other allies are engaged with Iran in war, unfortunately, and very sadly. But in light of the fact that you have the Mujahideen in Albania, for instance, their global headquarters, this resistance group, first to the Shah and now to the present regime, means that, for instance, Albania is tangentially part of this narrative, as are other areas of the world. It's not contained.
And this was actually going to be my next question. You know, before we go down into the Albanian level, and this is a very important point, I want to talk about the Western Balkans. You know, we both know that this region is unstable. You know, there's influences from Russia, influences from China, disputes between neighbors. How does instability of this type between some of the world's biggest powers, how can this resonate in the region? Does it risk causing more sort of aftershocks to already present instability?
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, for instance, in the case of migration, if there were to be a decisive war with Iran, that could cause millions of Iranians to seek relocation. It could also cause factions within the current Iranian government to splinter and move to different points of the world, in particular Europe. And at the same time, it could encourage other activities, soft power activities on the part of Iran and its allies in the Balkan region.
Do you think it gives sort of power to other nefarious actors, Russia, for example, to cause more trouble in these areas? You know, there's this other big problem going on, and they will use that to their advantage.
Well, there's no question about that. Russia will do everything it can to take advantage of the unfortunate and sad Iranian predicament. They have been in tandem now for decades. We go back in my memory, in my lifetime, to the 1950s, when the Russians were very much involved in Iran, the famous coup, the Shah exits, the Shah is called back again. All of this is orchestrated from the American side by Kermit Roosevelt, but very much the Russians are part of that narrative. However nationalistic the government that was taken down, it's repeated at the same time. This will trigger Russian aggression with the support of the Iran, of many folks who serve as frontline operators on behalf of Iran.
I see it as well, you know, in the way that while the West is looking one direction, you know, it leaves sort of a weakness in the armor, so to speak, where people like, you know, actors like Russia may try and exploit things in the region. I wanted to ask as well, now, Trump said recently that he had averted a war between Kosovo and Serbia. And I'm just wondering, he said it was to do with trade threats. Now, I'm wondering, do you think that was true? Do you think he was involved in stopping that from happening? Do you think there was any chance that Serbia and Kosovo were going to enter into an armed conflict?
I think what's very important is that historically, very aggressively, President Trump succeeded in bringing the Serbs and the Kosovans to the table in the White House to sign agreements. Sadly, he lost the election, and those agreements were allowed to lapse or to never come into reality. I believe that right now, the President of the United States will do anything he can to avert a conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, because the last thing the West, the last thing the global free, in fact, need right now is any altercation in the Balkans.
But I mean, okay, he brought them to the table, and I remember those agreements when they were signed. But then we have a situation in Kosovo at the moment where there's no functioning government. They've got local elections coming up later in the year. Who knows what's going to happen there? Kurti does not have a particularly good history, perhaps, with Trump and Richard Grenell from before. Do you see this as a potential issue for US diplomacy at this moment in this region?
I think that ultimately President Kurti, Richard Grenell, and President Trump are cut from the same cloth. I believe that although their position in the political spectrum might be different, that if President Trump were the prime minister, lo these many years, in Kosovo, he would be doing exactly or much the same as Prime Minister Kurti has done. And I firmly believe that when the dust settles, there will be agreement and commonality between the United States and the government that will be formed in Kosovo.
That's interesting that you made that comparison between them. I hadn't really thought of it before. You know, they're cut from the same cloth, but they are all that sort of very stubborn sort of character that doesn't back down and has their beliefs, and this is how we're going to stick to it. And I'm not going to listen to what you say. I'm going to do things my way. My concern is how those three will then find a common way forward.
Well, I will say this much. All three of them are very much that way until they are not.
Yes.
I have advocated or suggested to Prime Minister Kurti a certain point, and he was diametrically opposed to it, presented me papers as to why this particular point of view was not a particularly interesting one that he absolutely could not support. And then at a certain point, he supported it and he changed his position on it. So, you know, he is a strong personality, but to survive the combined opposition of Serbia, Russia, China, France, Germany, to survive against all these operators has been quite something, and he should be lauded for that.
Yes. I'm curious, though, and I'm going completely off script here, but Vučić, do you think he's cut from the same cloth, or is he a different breed entirely?
Well, I think that he's cut from the same cloth, but I think that unlike Kurti, unlike Grenell, unlike President Trump, I think that he has serious aspects about his personality and how he operates that are seriously disruptive, because it is clear that it is time for accommodation. It is clear that Kosovo, except in name only, was virtually a republic.
Yes.
It's clear that Montenegro, which was majority Orthodox, was allowed to leave the union with Serbia with no problem. It's irrational, especially since I remember very, very clearly the founding president of Kosovo agreeing very much with me. This was reported in the press that holy sites such as Peš and Dakane and others could take on an absolute autonomous condition. And therefore, there have been reasonable approaches made, sincere, reasonable approaches that have just been put asunder and aside. And I think that that's where the difference is.
For me, I think Vučić is cut from the same cloth in the way that, you know, he has his mind, he's stubborn in that sort of way, he's a big character. But for me, it's very much a cloth of the 80s, of the 90s, of a regime long gone that I don't think has a place in the kind of diplomacy and attitude that's needed to move this region forward. But who am I? That's just my view.
No. I agree with you. I think that's completely part of the narrative. There's no question about it.
Now, let's talk about Albania. Albania has severed all ties with Iran from several years ago. So the embassy is closed. It was raided and closed. All the diplomats were kicked out. They have repeatedly said they are not going to work with the Iranian regime. And this is a years-old dispute as well. Albania was subject to a huge cyber attack, I think it was 2022, and more recently as well. They brought, you know, government systems to their knees. This hasn't happened, as far as I know, in other countries. You know, should we be worried about things going beyond this sort of hybrid attack? What is the risk to Albania from Tehran now? And then also, should the conflict escalate again?
I think that the same type of risk is there vis-a-vis Iran. There's no question about it. And Iran has launched this attack, this cyber attack, this serious cyber attack to a NATO member.
Yes.
And indeed, NATO allies rallied, in particular the United States, to the side of Albania, which is a strong American ally, a strong NATO ally. And the United States gave all assistance to try to ameliorate the situation. However, this could very much continue to the degree that the Mujahideen are still in Albania and still acting very much against the current regime in Iran.
Now, talking about the MEK, I live not so far from the US Embassy. Over the last couple of months, predating the sort of resurgence in tensions in Iran, there was graffiti popping up on the walls in the streets nearby the embassy. Down with MEK, Rajavi out, you know, various things. And 2025, always with this tag as well. Now there's armed police outside the embassy. I mean, there's vans parked there, guys with big machine guns and things. It's a bit concerning, you know, things seem to be escalating. And the fact that this graffiti is being done by someone, I have to wonder, you know, who's doing it? Who is inside Albania doing this? Is the US doing anything additional to protect Albania in this situation that you're aware of?
Well, I am not aware of anything, but I can say this much. All you have to do is look at NATO and the NATO treaty and understand that all NATO members stand with Albania. And those nefarious players who are writing the graffiti are clearly trying to agitate the situation. Listen, although the Mujahideen were originally vicarious opponents of the Shah and are perceived in many quarters to be extremely harsh and still of questionable nature, it would seem that they have morphed into a somewhat different organization, if one can believe what they're saying. A part of the global free community now, supported by certain very conservative, democratic-based politicians in America. If that is true, if it is, that is obviously a vehicle that might help in the future in any narrative, and therefore any narrative of change or evolution in the context of Iran, and therefore they will be attacked, Albania will be attacked, and indeed the United States and the other allies will be attacked one way or another. I do not believe that it obviously will come to direct conventional warfare, but today there are 100 other ways to wage war.
Yeah. Now, you say, you know, do we believe? I have been in their camp in Durrës. I was invited there as a women's rights activist, and everyone was over a certain age. I mean, what I saw there, I've written about. I'm not going to go into it in huge details. I'm not completely convinced. Also, the age factor as well. Without being ageist, you know, they were all over a certain age, and this was sort of 6 years ago. Do you think they are potentially a credible replacement for the regime? You know, is there going to come a point where the US says, you guys, you know, you taking over power in Iran, it's just not credible anymore? Or also, do you think there's going to come a point where Albania is like, look, this is just too much risk for us to shoulder. We can't keep them here anymore?
Well, I do not feel that they are a credible entity to in a primary way assume any kind of new role in Iran in the future. You know, a cleric such as, you know, Saeed Khamenei might have greater possibility in the future. The Shah's son, Reza Shah, might have some greater possibility in the future. Certain military leaders, certain generals in Iran will have greater credibility. Look, Iran is an ancient, remarkable civilization. Yes. And we have seen in the last decades, on several occasions, millions of Iranians rising up against the extremist Muslim Shia dogma that runs the country. And they were not assisted by the West or the global free. I prefer to use that term, the global free. But now we have attacked Iran, and in many quarters, justly so. But this does not necessarily result in millions of people rallying around a change of regime movement, at least at this point. Although there's no question about it. I've spoken with dozens and dozens of Iranians, both in the diaspora, Iranians who've been back and forth just recently in the last couple of days. And there is still this bedrock of change that people want. But the Mojahedin is not going to in any way, shape, or form lead that change. They fought against Iranians when they were resident in Iraq. Yes. And any more than Americans would ever support a group that fought against the United States. That has nothing to do with whether the regime at the time is good or bad. It has more to do with the old nationalist fervor that can be generated. But there are things that we can do from the outside to ameliorate all of this. And as you know, I'm an emissary of the Bektashi, which is this Sufi moderate group of Shia Muslims that could seriously, if given the support and backing that they require, do much to ameliorate and lessen the trauma when there will eventually be changes in Iran.
But, okay, so we're saying the MEK are not a credible option to take over, you know, from any regime change. Does that call into question their protection, ongoing protection in Albania, at a time it's causing more risk and danger for the country? Like, at a point, surely there has to be a sort of balance. You know, if they're no longer a credible opposition, You know, at what point does Albania's safety become more important? Do you see what I'm trying to say? You know, are the Albanian government
Yes.
going to turn around at some point and say, we just can't take the risk anymore?
I fully understand. I understand where you're coming from. The Albanian government, this dynamic young prime minister, is doing so much and declaring that he will be announcing soon and recognizing an independent Bektashi state, which has to do with promoting the good and commonality and mutual understanding and that sort of thing, is certainly in very big contrast to the point of view that the Mujahideen persistently espouse. And at some point, in a judicious, fair, thoughtful, humanitarian way, there needs to be a rethink of that situation. But a rethink that does not necessarily put people to the door, as it were, or out the door, but a way that in a humane way takes care of them and understands they still have a role, but understand that that role cannot threaten the stability of Albania.
I have friends, good friends, who live very near their camp, and I mean, they're terrified. You know, they're really concerned about being so close to something which is a target, as admitted by Iran. But I wanted to ask you something else. When Trump, over the last year, months as well, you know, he caused major headlines when he said, if you don't pay up your dues to NATO, I'm paraphrasing, you can't count on US support. So if you don't meet the 5% spending target, we're not going to support you. Albania doesn't yet meet that threshold, although it is working quite hard to do it. Do you think this calls into question any potential protection or support for Albania in the future as well?
I think that the ties between Albania and the United States are so strong that whether Albania, a small country, meets the target of 5%, given all that they are doing, given the fact that they have hosted the Mujahideen for these many years now.
And Afghans as well?
Afghans, they have received Afghans. They have been amenable to not only the United States, but amenable to Italy and so many other partners and members of the EU, that I think that if you're talking in terms of strict 5% terms, Albania will be considered an anomaly. What is really outrageous, and what Trump is really aiming his comments at, is a country like Holland, the Netherlands, that pays virtually nothing to its defense, and meanwhile takes that $1 trillion and develops the most advanced high-tech industry in the world, period. That's graced the American taxpayer.
Yes.
And quite frankly, graced other Europeans who've donated the money. Again, the issue is not Albania and its payments. The issue is Netherlands, which pays absolutely virtually nothing.
Albania may not have hit the 5%, but it's made up for it in many other ways. Also, I think, considering the number of Albanians in the US, he probably wouldn't want to, you know, have them all marching on the street protesting. You know, it's quite a sizable number.
Well, I would say that having worked with the Albanian and the Kosovo community in the United States now for 3 decades, I have never seen such a small community better organized, at least until recently. The leaders such as Jim Gemma are an example of an individual, and I worked with him closely. We worked together. I mean, literally, if it were not for Jim Gemma on this side of the Atlantic in the context of working in America, there would be no independent Kosovo. Again, what happened in Kosovo, brave and courageous Kosovans did. But from a political standpoint in America, the Kosovo community has been unbelievable. The Albanian community has been remarkable. If it were not for Fan Noli, there would have been no agreement that the United States recognized Albania in the 1920s, for instance.
And let's hope we can bring Fan Noli's body back to Albania at some point. There's an ongoing campaign for this.
That would be wonderful. Having met him because he was a friend of my dad's. That would have been a wonderful thing. But one of the most important things, if I may, and just in case we don't touch on this, I cannot emphasize more the importance to the world that Prime Minister Rama and the legislature, the Assembly of Albania and the people of Albania, as moderate members of the Islamic world, I cannot emphasize more the importance of promoting the Bektashi are, because they represent a faction, a group, a voice within the Islamic world that is not given the millions and millions of dollars of support. Remember, Hamas was created by Israel and the United States. The Mojahideen and many of these other folks, Afghanistan, many of these radical groups have the blueprint of the CIA, of Israel and France and England, all over them. The Bektashi speak to peace, speak to commonality, speak to inclusion, speak to harmony, and speak to love. And I think what Prime Minister Rama is doing in promoting and declaring that there will be an independent Bektashi state is he is giving the future of Europe and the global free a huge boost, because the great threat of religious extremism, in this case we're talking about Islamic extremism, as well as extremism from other communities, could really undo the incredible human progress that we have made over the last 2,000 years to create a just, humanist, scientific, thoughtful, as well as faith-based civilization.
Now, before I move on to my last question, having interviewed Baba Mondi, but also having met him and talked with him and shared a rakia with him, because this is something that's allowed in Bektashiism. In what Islamic religion would a woman journalist be able to sit with a leader who's male alone and share a drink together? Perfectly innocently, professionally, but this just wouldn't happen, you know, and I can confirm, having spoken to him, listened to him, that what he cares about is peace and empowerment and justice, and it was quite refreshing to hear this from him. Now, my last question is, Trump, his method of diplomacy is perhaps a little different to other people's methods of diplomacy. He antagonizes, he swears, he makes, you know, really rash claims and insults and threats, but yet somehow, sometimes it seems to kind of work. But do you ever feel that these are big risks he's taking when he's, you know, sometimes he'll come out with something and I think, oh no, that's it, you know, we're going to be nuked now. But then the outcome, it seems to kind of calm things down. Do you ever worry that he's playing a dangerous game with the kind of rhetoric he uses? Or is this like a public persona and then behind the scenes there's something very different going on? Because I worry that he might put a foot wrong and goodbye civilization. You know, what are your thoughts on his style of diplomacy?
I thoroughly find the President Trump's style of diplomacy viable, effective. The results are there on the table. Look at the war between Congo, in the Congo. That war has effectively, at least for the moment, for the first time in 20 or 30 years, come to an end. That is an incredible accomplishment in itself. Remember, President Trump inherited these wars. He did not create these wars. And I think that the generic, bureaucratic-based treaty and discussion and negotiation industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry of hotel bills and conferences and catering and sustaining maybe 100,000 individuals throughout the world in simply pushing the can down the corridor, rather than standing it upright and saying, what the hell, if I could use one of President Trump's terms, maybe, what the hell we can now do about it. I think it's downright refreshing that someone calls it like it is, and generally we hear and see what's going on. And he's masterful. I mean, I'm not saying that his enemies are happy about it. Certainly, when he said that I'm going to discuss for 2 weeks as to what we're going to do in Iran, and then bang, the next morning the bombing begins, would shock some people. But these strategies, going back to Alexander the Great, these are not unusual strategies.
No.
You can look at ancient Chinese writings. You can look at how Washington prosecuted his war, and how Ho Chi Minh, inspired by Washington, prosecuted the war first against the French and then against the Americans. So I think it is a refreshing thing to see the Trump narrative. Having said that, that does not mean that there are not risks. I am saddened. I am very saddened to see what is happening in Gaza, and I would like to see him step up and ameliorate that situation as much as possible.
Thank you for saying that, because obviously, yeah, what has happened in Gaza, the tens of thousands of people, including civilians, I mean, this is not acceptable. This approach needs to be applied more fairly as well. And I can say that to the EU as well. We can't turn a blind eye to what, we can't criticize one country for one thing and turn a blind eye to another country which does it. That's my view.
Well, I consider myself a graduate of Kibbutz and Dor in Israel, and I myself have had a long, good discussion with Prime Minister Netanyahu at one point. I empathize with the Israeli narrative in history, but we must sustain humanity, and we must sustain love and fairness in what we do, and that needs to be brought back into focus. And I believe that Trump is in a very difficult position, but somehow, one way or another, all of this will work for the betterment of the entire global free world, and hopefully in the region of the Middle East and thereabouts, there will be good things that come from this realignment. There is a desperate feeling among millions of folks in the Middle East. The Gulf states are a prime example, from whether it's the Gulf states in the east or Morocco in the west. There is a desire to find commonality with Israel, and thereby commonality with the world.
As we say in English, like, there's some method to his madness. You know, I might not like him particularly or some of the things he does, but yeah, I see your point here. Method to madness, I think, is the phrase. Christopher, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And I hope to have you maybe in the studio in person at some point in the future.
Well, I hope to be in Albania soon, so looking forward to seeing you.
Yes,
and thank you.
We'll meet for a coffee.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
All right. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Paul, welcome to Inside Albania. Thank you for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you online with me today.
Good to be with you.
Let's get to the first question. Now, you have been with the CIA, you were with the CIA for a very long time. You have experience in this area, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, what can you tell us about the MEK? Who are this group that are currently in Albania?
The MEK is an Iranian opposition group that has its origins back in the 1960s, when the Shah was still the ruler of Iran. It opposed the Shah's rule. It was engaged in violent activities then. It earned its later label as a terrorist group with some of the operations that it conducted, and indeed some American officials fell victim to MEK violence. So it was acting in parallel with Ayatollah Khomeini's actions, one could say, in overthrowing the Shah. But later it had a falling out with the Islamic Republic and turned against it. I think the signal event in that history, certainly from Iranians' point of view, was that the MEK threw in its lot with the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq during the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, in which it in effect became a kind of security auxiliary to the Iraqi forces. And then since then, it has had this sort of checkered physical and political history, which had it going on and off the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations. And now, as you know, its main physical location is a camp in Albania. I think I just want to add further thing. Many people have characterized it as a cult, which I think is an accurate description. It had this couple, now the remaining survivor, Mariam Rajabi, who have treated it as a cult. So you can put whatever label you want on it: terrorist group, cult, opposition group. All of those have applied to it at different times.
Now, I want to say as well, criticizing the MEK does not make someone pro-Iran. This is a narrative which has been used against me before. I've been inside the camp. I went to one of the rallies. I was invited before they realized that I was a journalist. And what I saw was quite cult-like, but I was massively attacked when I wrote about it and accused of being paid by Iran and supporting Iran, which is absolutely not the case. So I want to preclude the rest of our conversation by saying that being critical of the MEK does not equate to support for Iran. But the MEK have, at this rally I was at, there were extremely senior people from the American government and former officials of the American government there speaking in support of the MEK. They have enjoyed significant support from the US, from the UK, from Albania itself. Is this genuine? Is it support for them, or is it opposition towards Iran?
It's two things. One, it's opposition to Iran, and you speak a very important truth when you mention that any criticism of the MEK is not to be equated with support for the current Iranian regime. But unfortunately, that is one of the ways in which the MEK has played in American politics, and they've won a lot of the support, including members of Congress and other prominent Americans, as you mentioned. That's one aspect of the story. The other is they have basically bought, with cash, a lot of that support, providing large speaking fees to prominent American figures to speak at their rallies, that sort of thing. I think it's still somewhat of a mystery exactly where all that money comes from, but I think it's a combination of this basically being bought and as you mentioned, trying to equate any kind of opposition to the current Islamic Republic as something to be praised, no matter what the nature of the group involved, and I think it's a loathsome nature when we're talking about the MEK.
And I mean, speaking fees are a thing. If I go and speak somewhere, sometimes I get an honorary or a fee. It really depends, So these speaking fees are normal in many circles, but you touched on something to do with where the money comes from. Is this something that the CIA in your time has ever looked at or sort of tried to trace? Or you can't say.
Possibly. I can't speak directly to that, but I think it's anything like that, and certainly under the current U.S. administration, there would be an awful lot of sensitivity about that sort of thing, and probably hesitation to dig very, very deeply into it. Although, I should mention when the lobbying in favor of the MEK in Washington succeeded in getting them off the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations, it was actually back during the Obama administration. So it's not something that is unique to any U.S. administration, Republican or Democrat, in terms of how the whole MEK issue has been handled.
And obviously, they are a target of Iran, and as Albania is hosting them, Albania has been targeted by Iran through cyber attacks. Do you think there is any danger of an escalation in the kind of attacks Albania could face in keeping MEK here? And do you think there's a point where Albania might say it's maybe not worth, keeping them?
There may well be a danger, and I think this relates to what we've just seen transpire over the last 2.5 weeks, the war in which Israel, later joined by the United States, attacked Iran. And the Iranian regime, although I don't think it's on the verge of collapsing anytime soon, is obviously feeling very vulnerable with regard to any kind of opposition. And we've seen it inside Iran since the start of the war, and it continues now, a harsh crackdown on not only genuine opposition, but just suspected opposition. You know, the first priority is to try to find any of those Israeli spies that have been working inside Iran, but the regime's crackdown is going far beyond that. Yes. So it is a part of this, I think, to reach out to any kind of opposition and try to crush it, negate it. And so this is just speculation, but I would not rule it out, and I would say the chances right now today are higher than they have been recently for the Iranians to try to do something about the MEK presence in Albania.
It's concerning, you know, it's near Tirana, it's in a relatively residential area. I mean, the small villages around it is quite worrying. Are there any other opposition groups sort of active, and how do you think the war in Iran has affected their approach to cracking down on this opposition? Is it what you said, they're now more likely to sort of go beyond borders to crack down on opposition? Now they feel cornered.
Well, you've got all kinds of varieties of opposition, including those who are not sworn enemies of the Islamic Revolution, are not radicals in any sort, but rather are ones we would consider sort of Iranian moderates who have supported in the past presidents like Khatami, who have been opposed to the hardliners on many policy questions in Iran. So that the hardliners in the current regime consider them as opponents as well. And then you've got other outside opposition, most notably the monarchists who are centered around Reza Pahlavi, the son of the current Shah. I should note that certainly with regard to Pahlavi, but it also applies more to the point to the MEK. The support inside Iran is at best minimal, and I will go farther than that to say the MEK is bereft of support inside Iran, and I think this mainly goes back to that history I mentioned earlier of the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, where the MEK was rightly considered a bunch of traitors in taking the side of Saddam Hussein. Iranians have not forgotten that. That was a horrible war in which hundreds of thousands of Iranians lost their lives. Yes. So they do not have support inside Iran.
Talking about Iran as a nefarious actor, we see with Russia, it's not just the direct action it takes, but it also, for example, in the Western Balkans, it sows instability in other ways through misinformation, through fake news, through sort of putting a flame to already simmering sort of conflicts like with Serbia and with Kosovo. Do we see Iran working in this way, or are they more fond of the direct attack approach, whether it is militarily, maybe not so much, but things like cyber attacks, which they're pretty good at?
Oh, it's all of the above. There's no question. There's already an Iranian regime record in doing those sorts of things. They have conducted clandestine assassinations or attempted assassinations. Many of those have been in response to things the Israelis have tried to do. And I would not rule out the cyber operations as well. But no, the short answer is it's all of the above.
We could assume perhaps that there are Iranian operatives operating in the region as well, perhaps.
Yes, there are. Although I should note, that there is a countervailing consideration in that the regime is concerned about its relations with Europe in general and the European Union. And I think, this would be, at least in the backs of the minds of Iranian decision makers, if they contemplate any kind of operation, either clandestine or open, in Albania. Going back a number of years, you had, and this was going back to the early years of the Islamic Republic, you had a number of assassinations of exiled dissidents on European soil, places like France. And one of the main things that caused that campaign to come to an end several years later was the concern by the regime about the nature of its relations with the Europeans. Now, since then, we've got all kinds of complicating issues, the nuclear issue, of course, being the big one, and the relationship is not good at all between the Iranian regime and the EU and the major European powers because of that. But I think there's still the hope among most elements of the regime to someday have a civilized and mutually profitable relationship with the Europeans, and that would be a source of hesitation. But right now, I think that the main concerns are, well, not so much concerns, but the main impulse on the part of the regime is to strike back at any kind of source of opposition at a time of vulnerability in the wake of the U.S. and Israeli attacks.
And that potentially puts a target on Albania, because there's no other countries hosting an opposition group like of this magnitude.
That's right. I mean, well, there would be, individual, other exiled dissidents who might be the targets of assassination in other countries. But in terms of a group that has an organizational presence, someplace, yeah, you're talking about the MEK in Albania. Perhaps the only thing that comes remotely close to that is that the monarchists who I mentioned before around Pahlavi have kind of a concentration of support in the Los Angeles area in the United States, but it's still not equivalent to the MEK, having its presence at a camp in Albania.
Now, I want to ask you another question as well. President Donald Trump's diplomacy. It's a bit of a different breed from maybe the other kinds of diplomacy that we're used to. Everyone goes and they have a meeting and they shake hands and they take a picture after, or they don't, or, we've figured out a way forward, we've got to work together. He doesn't take that sort of approach. Does it ever make you a bit nervous how he sort of speaks and threatens and the language he uses? I mean, there seem to be some results, but knowing what you know about the various players involved in these discussions, does it ever make you think, oh, maybe he's playing with fire, or that's a bit of a risk to take?
No, it's not just makes me nervous, it makes me dismayed. I mean, this applies not just to the issues we're talking about, but the whole corpus of foreign policy. And we've seen some of you say, well, it sometimes gets results. I mean, there are other results. You can look at polling numbers in which people in foreign countries are asked, what countries they respect or admire, or basically have a positive or negative opinion. And the U.S. poll numbers have plummeted since Trump came back to power. And you've got alliances that are totally wrecked. We have the Canadians next door who have been traditionally our closest and best friends, and Trump has made an enemy out of them. I mean, that's awful.
He threatened to invade Greenland, I mean, poor Greenland and Denmark. They weren't expecting that.
All that sort of nonsense. Yeah, there has been damage done to U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. standing in the world that will take many, many, many years to repair, even after Trump is no longer on the scene.
He said as well locally, that he'd managed to avert a war between Kosovo and Serbia as well. And, I don't know if that's true or not. It's maybe not your area of expertise, but it's just a dangerous game to be playing, with these big sort of authoritarian type characters who are somewhat unpredictable. I include him in that description as well. It just seems it's a very fine line to walk between someone getting annoyed with him and pressing the nuke button, or managing to actually resolve the situation.
Well, yeah, in terms of, cavorting with dictators, then when you're in the European area, we're talking about a couple of regimes in particular, obviously Putin's. And, Trump has had this strange and as yet largely uncovered relationship with the Russians and with Putin's regime, going back to before he was president, and he was seeking, to build do real estate deals, in Moscow, that sort of thing. And then of course there's the relationship with the Orban regime in Hungary, which is really kind of the bad boy of the European Union, and certainly the biggest black mark among EU countries in terms of retrogressing from what had been a democracy into more of an authoritarian state. And Trump, admires that sort of thing. He's a would-be dictator himself. So even in the European realm, you see a lot of damage being done.
Yes.
And notwithstanding the kind of cringeworthy scenes we saw at the recent NATO summit, in which we have foreign leaders, including the Secretary General of the alliance, figuring out that the best way to try to get some positive result from Trump is just to flatter him obsequiously. As I say, it is cringeworthy, and maybe it does get some results, but
they're probably terrified that they'll be the next target, if they don't flatter him enough.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's worked domestically here in the United States,
Yes, yeah.
where even individuals who had been considered allies of Trump or members of his party become targets of his wrath and of retribution because they said something that maybe differed with one of his assertions. So that sort of dynamic plays out in the foreign realm as well as domestically.
Yes. I'm a member of an international journalists organization. I've been a member of them for 15 years, and this was the first time they've ever issued a travel warning for the United States for journalists, with a full list of instructions of what to do, what not to do, precautions to take to protect yourself, your data, your devices, etc. I mean, it was something that really shocked me. These are travel warnings you'd expect if you were going into sort of an active war zone, or North Korea, perhaps, not the United States. It's quite a disappointing turn of events.
Yeah, there are very sound reasons for anyone traveling to the United States to be concerned about those sort of things, and it certainly applies to journalists as well as to anyone else.
Yes, it's a sad state of affairs. Paul, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. I wish we had longer. Thank you for everything you've said today.
You're quite welcome.
Thanks. That's all for this week. You can follow Inside Albania every Saturday at 4 o'clock on Euronews Albania, on our YouTube channel, Euronews Albania, and across all major podcasting platforms. Until next week, Mirë Pafshim!